The world outside Evan's apartment was oddly still. A gentle breeze stirred the autumn leaves along the pavement, and the air, crisp and cool, carried the faint scent of rain. It was the kind of evening where everything felt perfectly ordinary. A calm before the storm, though Evan had no idea that a storm was coming. He had just gotten off his night shift at the toll booth, the familiar hum of the highway long gone in his rearview mirror. All he wanted now was a warm meal and a few hours of sleep before doing it all over again. Evan had just settled into a small, sparsely furnished living room, the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly as they flickered on and off. He flicked through the TV channels half-heartedly, barely noticing the blank screen before him. The distant sounds of traffic echoed down the street below his window, a constant reminder that life outside continued without pause, without warning. Then it happened. The sudden blare of a loud emergency siren sliced through the silence, making Evan flinch. He froze. It wasn't like the usual weather alerts or the odd flood warning. This was something different. His phone, sitting on the coffee table in front of him, vibrated violently. The screen flashed a glaring red, a stark contrast against the otherwise tranquil scene in his apartment. Evan picked it up, his heart beginning to race before he even saw the message. The words burned into his eyes. Emergency alert, close all windows. The message blinked across his screen, bold and urgent. His finger hovered over the phone, uncertain what to do with it. He stared at the words, his mind racing for a rational explanation. What was this about? It didn't make sense. There was no context, no additional information, just a warning to close all windows. But why? And why now, of all times? He glanced around his apartment. The windows were already shut. The weather outside looked perfectly fine, nothing out of the ordinary. Evan could hear the occasional honk from a car passing by, but nothing unusual. His phone buzzed again, a notification from his neighbor, Kyle, in apartment 4B just down the hall. The message read, "What the hell is this? Anyone know what's going on?" Evan typed a quick reply, "No idea. Weird." He set the phone back down and stood, pacing around the room. His unease grew. The faint sounds of the city outside continued uninterrupted. No emergency vehicles, no sirens, just the rhythmic hum of the world continuing as it always had. But something felt off, like a heaviness in the air that didn't belong. The more Evan thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the veil of normalcy. He stood by his living room window, looking out across the street at the row of identical buildings, their windows dark and still. He watched for a few moments, then noticed movement across the way. A man in a heavy coat standing just outside his own apartment window. The man wasn't moving, simply staring out into the street, his back slightly hunched, his body still as a statue. Evan's pulse quickened, and he turned his gaze back to his phone. The alert was still flashing on the screen, as if it had been burned into his mind. Something about the message seemed off. The word windows felt like an oddly deliberate choice. Why not doors? Why not stay indoors? A sharp knock at the door startled him, breaking his train of thought. He jumped back, heart pounding. He hadn't been expecting anyone, not at this hour. He cautiously approached the door, looking through the peephole. Kyle's familiar face stared back at him, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Evan hesitated before unlocking the door and opening it slightly. "What's going on?" Kyle asked, his voice strained. He wore a thick winter jacket despite the mild weather. "Not sure," Evan muttered. "Just got some weird alert, something about closing windows. It's..." He trailed off, still feeling a little ridiculous. Who would take something like that seriously? Kyle glanced nervously behind him, his eyes darting over his shoulder. "I haven't opened any windows. Didn't even get an alert, though. You sure it's legit?" Evan's stomach twisted as he watched his neighbor's unease grow. He had been living in the same building for over a year now, and Kyle had always been the type of guy who ignored even the most obvious dangers. For him to act this worried meant something was definitely wrong. Before Evan could respond, Kyle suddenly jerked his head toward the window, his eyes widening. "What the hell is that?" Evan turned, following his gaze toward the street outside. The man he had seen earlier was still there, only now he was no longer standing still. The man was shuffling, his body twisting unnaturally as he took slow, deliberate steps, his arms bent at strange angles. The skin on his face, pale and gaunt, looked stretched too tight, as if something was trying to break out from within. His mouth opened, but there was no sound, only an eerie silence hanging in the air. "What the hell?" Kyle whispered again, his breath quickening. "Call the cops," Evan said, his voice shaking as he reached for his phone. "I tried. No answer," Kyle replied, his voice frantic. "It's like the whole city went dead. No one's answering anything." Evan's stomach dropped. The weight of that statement hit him hard. It wasn't just his phone. It was everything. The silence outside deepened, swallowing any sounds of traffic or life. Evan stepped back from the door, his mind racing. Something was wrong. Fundamentally wrong. His fingers fumbled with the phone as he tried to check for any new updates, but his screen remained stubbornly blank. The alert had disappeared. The only message left on his screen now was that cryptic warning. "Close all windows." The sound of a distant scream reached his ears. Kyle stiffened, his eyes locking onto Evan's with pure fear. That was from across the street. Evan swallowed, his heart pounding louder than before. The screams were no longer distant. They were all around them now. He forced himself to look out the window once more, his hands trembling. Across the street, his neighbor's window was wide open, and the figure inside was gone. In its place stood something else, a tall, shadowy figure, its body oddly contorted, its limbs far too long. It was staring straight at Evan, unmoving. Then the figure opened its mouth. A strange low moan poured from its throat, a sound that was neither human nor animal. And Evan could feel it, could feel the vibration of that sound as if it were coming from deep inside him, pulling at his core. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Kyle backed away from the door, his face pale, terror etched into his features. "We should leave," Kyle said, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." But Evan couldn't move. His mind was frozen on the figure outside, the empty stare that seemed to bore into him from across the street. He had done everything right, closed the windows, locked the doors. But this was something else. This wasn't a simple emergency. Then the tapping began. It was soft at first, like a gentle knock on the window. But the sound grew louder, sharper, as if it were being repeated from multiple directions, from every window, from every corner of his apartment. The sound was inside now. Evan's breath hitched in his throat, and Kyle's voice grew frantic as he stumbled backward into the hallway. "Evan, please, let's go. This isn't safe." The tapping intensified, followed by the faintest whisper, barely audible, but undeniably there. "Let me in." Evan's heart stopped. He didn't dare look toward the window again. But in the back of his mind, he could feel it. The presence outside, just waiting, just watching. And deep down, he knew. It had already begun. Evan's heart hammered in his chest, his hands trembling as the tapping at the window grew louder. The rhythmic sound echoed through the apartment, filling the otherwise quiet space with an eerie urgency. The whispers followed, indistinct but unmistakably there, somewhere in the deepening darkness beyond the glass. "Let me in." The voice was familiar, distorted, as if it were coming from a place both near and far. He forced himself to turn away, to push the sound out of his mind. But his thoughts wouldn't stop spiraling. He needed to do something. He needed to make sense of this before whatever was out there breached his home. Kyle was still standing in the hallway, too terrified to approach the door. Evan glanced back at him. "We need to find out what's going on. Someone has to know something." Kyle didn't respond immediately, his eyes glued to the door like he was waiting for it to burst open. He had already tried to contact anyone he could think of. Family, friends, local emergency services. But the silence on the other end was deafening. Calls went straight to voicemail, and every attempt at communication felt more futile than the last. The news was no help either. Whatever was happening seemed to be spreading too quickly for any kind of reliable information to get out. The only thing Evan had been able to glean from his phone was the alert message, which had now vanished. The "close all windows" message had disappeared, leaving only silence in its wake. His phone buzzed again, and Evan snatched it up, praying it was a message from someone he could trust. The screen flashed. An unknown number, one that wasn't even in his contacts. "Hello?" Evan answered quickly. The voice on the other end was breathless, panicked. "Evan, it's Liam. What's happening? What's going on?" The name snapped Evan to attention. Liam was his best friend, the one person who always managed to stay level-headed, but the tremor in his voice was unmistakable. This wasn't the Liam Evan knew. I don't know, man, Evan said, trying to steady his own nerves. I got the same alert. I've been trying to reach people, but nothing's making sense. Where are you? There was a long pause, the only sound the soft hum of static from the other end of the line. Then, Liam's voice came back, low and strained. I'm at my apartment, on the other side of town. The streets are deserted. I've been getting messages, just like you. I've been hearing voices outside too, Evan. But not like normal voices. Something's wrong. People or things. I don't know what they are anymore. Evan's grip tightened around the phone. What do you mean? What's happening to them? Liam's voice cracked. I don't know. They're not people anymore. They don't look right. They're moving wrong, like they're in a hurry to get somewhere, but they don't care about anything around them. They're walking in patterns, like they're following some kind of invisible line. Some are knocking on doors asking to come in, just like the warning said. But when they talk, their faces don't move. They look dead. I'm locked inside, but I think I saw one of them, my neighbor. He looked like he was melting. Evan's stomach dropped, the feeling like he was being sucked into a void. Melting? What kind of explanation could there be for that? I don't know if I'm safe, Evan. Liam's voice continued, more frantic now. And I can't even leave the apartment. No one can. I don't know what's happening. You've got to get out of there. Get somewhere safe. But as Evan opened his mouth to respond, the line went dead. His phone screen flickered before it too went black. He glanced at the phone, frustration bubbling up inside him. He tried to reboot it, but it wouldn't turn on. Dead. Another lifeline cut off. The whispering returned, louder now, as if the voices had multiplied. A low, garbled chorus calling out from every direction, taunting him with their hollow words. Let us in. It was as though the walls themselves were breathing, pushing against him, testing him, forcing him to confront the impossible. Evan glanced over at Kyle, who was now pacing in a circle, muttering to himself. His eyes were wide, twitching nervously as he continued to glance toward the windows. What the hell is going on, Evan? Kyle hissed, his voice trembling. What do you think is outside? Those things, those people, what are they? Why are they doing this? Evan didn't have the answer, and he wasn't sure he wanted to know. He grabbed his jacket, deciding to venture outside, if only for a moment. He needed to see it, to understand if what he was hearing and seeing was real. He needed confirmation that he wasn't losing his mind. The tapping from the windows continued, though now it seemed more insistent, more violent. The thing outside his window had begun to bang against the glass, the sound deepening in intensity. Stay here, Evan said to Kyle, though his own voice cracked under the weight of his fear. Kyle's face was ashen. Evan, don't go out there. Please, I don't think you should. But Evan was already at the door. He yanked it open quickly, stepping out into the dim hallway. The building, normally a quiet, sleepy complex, now felt like a tomb. No sounds of movement, no footsteps, nothing except that same eerie silence that had filled the air since the alert had first sounded. The hallway lights flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. He approached the staircase slowly, every step amplified in the thickening quiet. There were no other tenants in sight. No movement. Nothing. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as if something were watching him from the shadows. He hesitated, but the need to understand, to see, overcame his better judgment. Evan reached the landing and looked out of the main window that faced the street. The fog was thicker now, rolling in like a slow-moving tide, blanketing everything in its wake. The streetlights were dim, their halos barely visible through the haze. And then something shifted. A figure stood at the corner of the block, facing toward him. At first, it appeared to be a person, standing motionless. But as Evan looked closer, he saw it. The figure was not just standing, it was shifting, its body warping and twisting in unnatural ways, like it was struggling to maintain its human form. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, and its limbs were bent at jagged, broken angles, as if its bones had been twisted and reset wrong. Evan's breath hitched. He felt his legs go weak. The figure didn't seem to notice him. Its focus seemingly trained on something else, something he couldn't see. As the figure took one slow step forward, its movements jerky and fluid. Evan's heart pounded louder in his chest. That's when he heard it. A loud bang echoed through the hallway, reverberating off the walls. It was followed by another, and then another, like fists pounding against the door. His pulse raced, his mind screaming at him to go back inside, but his body didn't respond. The figure outside started walking toward the building, its movements quicker now, almost predatory. Then, suddenly, a scream. A deafening, high-pitched wail that echoed through the streets, sending a chill down Evan's spine. It wasn't a human scream. It was guttural, animalistic, primal. It came from somewhere nearby, somewhere in the fog. The pounding on the door grew louder, faster, as if whatever was outside had caught wind of his fear and was closing in. Evan turned to run, but as he reached for the door, it suddenly flew open behind him. Someone was standing there, reaching for him. It wasn't Kyle. The apartment felt smaller with each passing hour, the walls slowly inching in, suffocating him. Evan could hear the hum of the refrigerator. An unnatural, almost mocking sound in the stillness. The light from his phone screen cast a faint glow on the floor, but even that felt too bright, too intrusive. The flickering of the apartment's lights had grown worse, each stutter and blink more unpredictable, like the building itself was on the brink of collapse. Evan sat on the edge of the couch, watching the shadows dance across the walls. The silence was deafening. It felt wrong, oppressive. Outside, there was nothing but an unsettling quiet, broken only by the occasional rustling of something, or someone, moving in the darkness beyond his windows. The wind howled faintly, but it didn't sound natural. It wasn't the kind of wind that whipped through trees or rattled windows. It was cold, deliberate, and it seemed to have a voice of its own. It whispered, or perhaps it called. The pantry was almost bare, the few cans of soup, crackers, and bottled water left dwindling. He thought it would be enough to last for a few days, but now every meal felt like a distant memory. His stomach growled in protest, the gnawing hunger making it harder to focus on anything. He had no idea how long it had been since the alert, how many hours or days had passed since the world outside had turned into something unrecognizable. But food wasn't the only thing running low. His strength was fading too. Each passing minute felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the world itself was pressing down on him. He tried to move, to do something, anything, but the exhaustion hung over him like a fog. His eyes were heavy, his body felt stiff, and a sense of dread gripped his chest like a cold, suffocating hand. It wasn't just the hunger anymore. It was the fear. Evan tried the phone again, hoping for a message, a sign of life. But the screen remained dark, the silence mocking him. His thoughts drifted to Kyle. He hadn't heard from him in hours, and the fear that his friend might be trapped, or worse, gnawed at him. The apartment felt colder now, the temperature having dropped in the last few hours, and it wasn't just the weather. It was something deeper, something that made the air feel thick and stifling. He wrapped himself in a blanket, but it didn't help. His skin was clammy, his limbs aching as though the isolation itself was seeping into his bones. And still the voices continued. It started as a soft murmur, faint and distant. Evan didn't know if it was his mind playing tricks on him or if it was real, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was just outside his window, watching him. The voices were fragmented, low whispers that danced just on the edge of his hearing, speaking in an unknown language. He couldn't make sense of it, but it was enough to make his skin crawl. A sudden tap at the window startled him, and he jerked back, his heart racing. For a moment, everything stood still. The air was thick with tension, his every nerve screaming at him to do something. He rose, cautiously moving to the window and peering through the blinds. The street was empty. No figures, no movement. Just the fog, thick and suffocating, swirling around the streetlights, casting long shadows on the pavement. But then, through the mist, he thought he saw something. Someone standing there. A tall figure, standing motionless, its face hidden in the shadow. It didn't move. It didn't blink. Evan stared, his breath coming shallow and fast. Was it just his mind playing tricks on him again? Was he really seeing things? He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the fatigue-induced haze, but when he looked again, the figure was gone. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady his shaking hands. Get a grip, he told himself. It's not real. It can't be real. But the voices, the whispers never stopped. Another tap at the window. This time louder, more insistent. "Let me in." It was unmistakable. The voice was so clear now, so close. Evan's stomach twisted. There was something wrong, something primal about the sound. It wasn't a human voice anymore. It was hollow, distorted. There was a rasp to it, a brokenness that sent a chill down his spine. Evan turned, pacing back and forth, his mind racing. He couldn't stay here, trapped in this apartment with his own thoughts, with the isolation closing in on him. He needed to get out. He needed to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. But when he reached the door, the one leading to the hallway, he hesitated. The hallway had been empty earlier, silent. But now the sound of shuffling feet echoed from beyond. He didn't know who or what was there, but he knew that whatever it wasn't something he could face alone. Maybe I can call for help. Maybe someone can help me. But as he reached for the phone again, the screen flashed to life for just a second. It flickered, distorted, as if the image itself was struggling to hold together. The words that appeared on the screen made his blood run cold. "They're not what they seem." Evan recoiled, heart thundering in his chest. It was a text message. No name attached, no number. The words hung there, suspended on the screen, as if someone or something was watching him, waiting for him to respond. He tried to call back the number, but it wasn't in his contacts. It went straight to voicemail, as expected, but this time there was a faint, garbled message recorded on the other end. The voice was unfamiliar, its tone low and harsh, like it had been distorted through static. "Don't open the window," the voice rasped. "Don't trust them. They've already seen you." The line went dead. Evan stood frozen, the weight of the warning settling over him like a blanket of ice. He felt his breath catch in his throat, the silence crashing down on him once again, thicker than before. And then from outside, a voice called again. "Let us in." It wasn't the same. It was different, closer, more desperate. The sound was slurred, like it came from someone drowning. The voice was breaking, shifting in ways that should have been impossible. Evan stumbled back, to the side, eyes wide, heart racing. He knew what he had to do, and yet he couldn't do it. But as the voice repeated its call, the sensation of being watched overwhelmed him. The darkness outside was alive, pulsating, as if it were slowly creeping toward him. "Let me in." And this time, he was sure of it. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. Evan's mind raced, each thought sharp and fleeting, like the flash of lightning that illuminated the apartment for a split second before darkness reclaimed it. The voice outside called again. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He couldn't stay trapped inside, suffocating with fear and hunger, surrounded by whispers and the sound of something or someone scraping at the walls. The whispering had intensified. It no longer came from just outside the window. It felt as though it was coming from all directions, an eerie cacophony that pressed in on him from all sides. The lights flickered once more, then died entirely, plunging the apartment into pitch black. His breath quickened, every noise amplified in the silence. His body trembled, his nerves fraying at the edges. "Let me in." The words curled around him like smoke, taunting him, promising answers that would only lead to more questions. Desperation clawed at him. He couldn't sit here waiting. He couldn't wait for whatever that thing outside was to make its way inside. He had to do something. Anything. Evan approached the window, his hands trembling as he reached for the blinds. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he slid the fabric aside, exposing a small crack in the corner of the window. The only thing visible outside was the dense fog, the streetlights glowing dimly through the mist like sickly eyes watching from the abyss. He could feel the heat of his breath against the cool glass as he leaned in closer, straining to hear over the pounding in his ears. The silence stretched on, suffocating, unbearable. And then, just as he was about to pull away, a sound sliced through the quiet. A shuffle. A dragging footstep, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was coming for him. Evan's heart slammed into his ribs. He couldn't tell where it was coming from, but he knew it was close. His pulse thundered in his ears as he bit down on his lip, holding his breath. The footsteps stopped. The eerie quiet returned, thick and suffocating. But the voice, it called again. "Let me in." The voice now sounded distorted, the words stretched and broken as if being pulled from a deep well. It wasn't human, it couldn't be. And in that moment, he made a decision. Evan's fingers hovered over the window latch, his mind screaming at him to stop. But the voice had stripped away every ounce of reason. He wasn't thinking anymore. His breath caught in his throat as he twisted the latch, the click of it far too loud in the stillness. He slid the window open just a crack. Just enough to hear more clearly, to see what was out there. The air that rushed in was sharp, like ice cutting through his skin. He sucked in a breath, and as the fog parted just enough, he caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. Something tall, humanoid, its long limbs twisted unnaturally. But the figure wasn't the worst part. It was the face, or rather, the lack of it. A black void stared back at him, where the face should have been. The moment the window cracked open, the temperature in the room plummeted. Evan's skin prickled, his teeth chattered, and yet he couldn't pull himself away from the view outside. The figure, its dark void of a face tilted toward him, stepped closer. With each movement, the air seemed to warp around it, like a mirage, shifting, twisting, becoming something else entirely. It was no longer simply outside. It was in the space between him and the rest of the world. It was in the apartment. He could hear the shuffle of its feet now, closer, louder. His pulse drummed against his temples, a thunderous beat that drowned out everything else. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive weight. And then, nothing. Evan swallowed hard, his throat dry, his heart racing. The apartment felt smaller than it ever had before, the walls closing in with every breath. The silence stretched on for an eternity, mocking him with its emptiness. He stepped back from the window, instinctively reaching for the door to the hallway. He wasn't sure what he hoped to find. Maybe another way out, maybe some kind of explanation. But the hall outside was dark, too dark, and it stretched on endlessly, like it was leading him into the depths of a nightmare. A sound, a soft shuffle, and then a whisper that sent a shock of terror through his spine. "You should have stayed in the dark." Evan whipped around, but there was nothing, just shadows, curling and twisting in the corners of the room, as if the darkness itself was alive, feeding on his fear. His eyes darted back to the window, and that's when he saw it. The figure wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the apartment, standing just behind him. He spun around, gasping for breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. The figure was taller than he remembered, its shape warping like liquid smoke, flickering in and out of existence. And then it moved. It was fast, too fast. It lunged at him with inhuman speed, its dark, void-like form consuming the space between them in a heartbeat. Evan's breath caught in his throat as a cold hand, no, not a hand, something worse, something slick and unfeeling, wrapped around his arm. He screamed, trying to pull away, but the grip was unbreakable. He could feel it pulling him closer, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. "No," he shouted, desperately clawing at the floor, at the walls, at anything he could reach. His body was trembling violently, every nerve alight with terror. The thing's whispering voice filled his ears again, cold and empty. "You open the window." The word sent a chill down his spine, paralyzing him with the weight of their meaning. He realized too late what the figure was, and what it represented. The warning, the alert, the thing outside. It had been coming for him all along, and the act of opening that window, the crack in the glass, had invited it in. The cold hand tightened around his wrist, and for the first time, Evan understood the full horror of what he was facing. It wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just one creature. It was a cycle. It had always been a cycle. Every one of those alerts, every one of those whispers, had been a trigger. And now he had become part of it. He had been marked. He had brought this upon himself. The thing leaned closer, its presence suffocating him. He could feel its breath, icy and unnatural against his skin, but he couldn't escape. The darkness swallowed him, and with it, all the air in the room. A sudden, garbled voice echoed in his mind. A transmission, or maybe just a memory. He couldn't tell. "Do you hear it? The others? They're out there, just like you." The whisper was softer now, distant, like it was coming from the corners of his mind, rather than the creature itself. Evan's vision blurred as the air grew thicker, the suffocating darkness closing in. And then, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no escape. The door, the windows, nothing would have saved him. The alert was never meant to be a warning. It was an invitation, a call to join them. His body went numb as the creature's influence spread through him like ice in his veins, But his mind was still aware, still awake. He could still think, still feel his heartbeat slow, still hear the haunting whisper of the voices around him. The last thought he had before everything went dark was a question. How many others had received the alert? The fog still clung to the streets like a living thing, swirling around the dim streetlights that blinked in and out of existence. The air was thick with the scent of something burning, something far worse than fire. And as the last of the night faded, the silence was shattered by a single voice. A whisper, soft and insistent. "Let me in. If you're still here, you've survived the horror, for now. But the story doesn't end here. What really happened to Evan? Who or what was on the other side of that window? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's unravel this nightmare together. Don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales and hit the bell icon so you never miss a moment of the madness. Stay vigilant, because the real horror might be closer than you think.